Hello everyone. I'm making this video in response to a bunch of people that I'm seeing on the internet telling others that the book of Revelation is not chronological. I intend to show in this video what I think the book of Revelation shows us and whether it is chronological or not. We're going to start in chapter 4 of the book of Revelation. Verse 1 says after this. That means chapter 4 comes after chapters 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to pay attention to what starts all the verses after this. Verse 2, and. Verse 3, and. Verse 4, and. 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 Now verses 10 and 11 do not have and in front of them because taken in context it is still talking about verse 9 and. Chapter 5, and, saying with a loud voice, still talking about the previous verse, and. In chapter 6, every single verse starts with and, except for verse 17, which is still talking about the previous verse. Chapter 7 has a few verses that don't start with and, but when you read them in context are still talking about the previous verse. Saying, hurt not the earth, still talking about the previous verse. Verses 5, 6, 7, and 8 are still talking about the 144,000 of the previous verse. Verses 15, 16, and 17 are still talking about the great multitude which you see in verse 14. In chapter 8, all verses start with and except for verse 7, which is still talking about the previous verse. In chapter 9, only 6 of the 21 verses don't start with and they are talking about the previous verse. In chapter 10, only one verse does not start with and. In chapter 11, only 4 of the 19 verses do not start with and. In chapter 12, only one verse does not start with and. In chapter 13, only 3 verses, 9, 10, and 18, do not start with and. In chapter 14, only 4 verses do not start with and. In chapter 15, 1 verse does not start with and. In chapter 16, only 3 verses do not start with and. Chapter 17 has 6 verses that do not start with and. Chapter 18 has the most by far verses that do not start with and. There are 9 of them. Chapter 19 has 4 verses that do not start with and. Chapter 20 has 2 verses that do not start with and. Chapter 21 has 5 verses that do not start with and. All the way into chapter 22 in the River of Life, we see the ands in the start of the verses. In any place there is not an and, it is still talking about the previous verse, and that is all the way from Revelation chapter 4 to chapter 22. Now let's go to the concordance and we'll find out what this word and is. Kahi, and even or also. Let's click on that. The part of speech, it's a conjunction. Do you know what a conjunction is? A word that joins together sentences, clauses, phrases, or words. So back to the book of Revelation. This and at verse 2 connects verse 2 to verse 1. The and in verse 3 connects verse 3 to verse 2. And this happens throughout the book of Revelation. So what do all the conjunctions tell us that happen throughout the book of Revelation? It tells us that it's chronological. You can't chop it up. You can't say, we're going to take this part here and put it somewhere else, like many people will take the 7 trumpets and stack them on top of the 7 seals. You can't do that because of the way Revelation is written. It's got conjunctions all the way through it, and it connects previous verses to the verses that follow. There is a second and more convincing reason why we can't take Revelation out of chronological order, and that is because of this, the seventh seal. And when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. Pay attention here to verse 2. And I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. The first thing the seventh seal does is opens up the trumpets. That means it's in chronological order. We can't chop it off here and stick the seven trumpets back at the same time as the seven seals. In the same way that the seventh seal opens up the trumpets, I believe the seventh trumpet opens up the seven bowls. Revelation 8, verse 13. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels which are yet to sound. In Revelation chapter 9, we see the fifth trumpet, and in verse 12, we see that the first woe is past. Also in chapter 9, we see the sixth trumpet, but it doesn't finish until chapter 11. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. Also in chapter 11, we see the seventh trumpet, but we never see anywhere else in the book of Revelation where the seventh trumpet or the third woe is past. The seventh trumpet goes from chapter 11 through chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, and in 15 we see the seven angels with the seven plagues, which is the seven bowls. And here they are just talking about them. They don't open yet until chapter 16. In my opinion, that means the seventh trumpet opens the seven bowls.